All right, I'll go ahead and start. So first of all, I just want to say thanks to everyone that's here. I'm going to be speaking about my personal journey with ayahuasca, how it helped me overcome depression, and eventually led me to where I'm at now, which is I am the curator and director of a retreat center in Mexico. So first, I'll just give a basic introduction and overview of what actually is ayahuasca. So it's mainly the components of two plants. So there's the Hebert, which is the source of DMT, and then there's Nestled coffee, which is the actual ayahuasca vine. They both grow together in the Amazon, and interestingly enough, like the plants independently don't really do anything. It's only when they're combined with a Amazonian science that creates the brew of ayahuasca and the spiritual experience. And then overall for this presentation, so I'm kind of going to give an introduction of my past and then my personal experience with ayahuasca. And then I'm going to share what ayahuasca is from an individual and spiritual perspective and what it actually does, and then what the experience is like, and then the process after a ceremony. So again, this is going to be very personal. This is a picture of me, of my old passport picture, and this picture was taken about 5 years ago, but I didn't look that much different a little more than 3 years ago. So my life was kind of defined by limiting beliefs. I had just reached this point in my life. I just believed that the point of existence is you live and you suffer and you die. These beliefs just pervaded into all areas of my life. They were on an emotional level, a physical level, a behavioral, and in all areas. It manifested into basically treatment-resistant depression. I had tried everything. I tried every antidepressant. I tried all kinds of different therapies. Nothing really had ever worked. And so one day, about 3 years ago, a therapist suggested ayahuasca. And like honestly, when she suggested ayahuasca, I would have done it in her office because I was that just kind of desperate to find a solution. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a bit of my past that eventually led me to this ceremony that I did 3 years ago. In order to get to that point, I'm going to go back in time, and I'm going to talk about a few things that happened even 15 years ago, and then I'm going to slowly move forward to that place. And so these events that actually happened, at first they might not seem relevant to what the experience is, but just trust me, because they'll culminate into what actually happened in my first ayahuasca ceremony. So about 15 years ago, there was an incident with my father. So my dad ended up having a psychotic breakdown in an airplane about 15 years ago. I was at home with my mom. We get a phone call from the FBI. And the phone call was that my father, who had never been in a fight in his life, had assaulted a male flight attendant on a flight because he thought the plane was being taken over by terrorists. What ended up happening is he was on a business trip to Canada. He'd been undiagnosed bipolar, and then eventually the stress got to him. He hadn't slept for several days. He thought the plane was being taken over by terrorists, and he ended up being institutionalized for a long period of time. It was to the point where when we first saw him, he didn't recognize his own family. So today my dad is okay, he's fine, but along this path, during this event, eventually he was able to get stabilized, back to normal, and he started seeing a doctor. And that doctor, I mean I can't give the doctor's name, but for the purpose of this presentation, I'll say the doctor's name is Dr. Plant. Now, we're going to go back about 7 years ago. So 7 years ago from today, I was living in Las Vegas. I had just moved to Las Vegas, and I was actually a poker dealer at the RA. But I had gotten to a point in my life that you can probably see from this picture, you just see it in my eyes, that I struggled with anxiety, depression, and it got to a point where I needed to do something because I was experiencing suicidal ideation. So I eventually decided to check myself into a mental health facility. So when I go into this health facility in Vegas, in the intake process, you need to see a doctor. So in this intake process, the doctor reads my name, and the first question he asks me is, "What's your dad's name?" So I tell him, and he's like, "You need to say who I am and reference myself." So it ended up being the exact same doctor that treated my dad. Complete coincidence. Like my dad is not living in Las Vegas. So through there, I got back to normal. I got relatively stable, and this doctor that I had saw, the one that had seen my dad, he recommended a therapist. So over the course of a few years in Las Vegas, I started seeing this therapist. And I had made some progress, but still like nothing would really work for me. And then, this is when COVID happens. So during COVID, I'm sure everyone went through their shit in COVID, but and that's when things really got bad. So, and in addition to just the fact that Vegas was shut down, like anyone that's been here during COVID or just here for this conference, you see Fremont Street. You could walk down the middle of Fremont Street and there was no people there. So what I started to do is I started to drink and watch Netflix. And it got to the point where I got to this point. So I was seeing this therapist, and finally the therapist suggested I go to rehab. So rehab allows me to stop drinking. Again, it's this kind of progress of some stability. And in rehab, I end up meeting a woman that I get into a relationship with. And again, I promise all these scattered events will coalesce into what happened at my first surgery. They tell you not to get into relationships for rehab, and I mean, there's a good reason why. But anyway, I didn't follow the rules. I didn't follow the instructions. So I start dating this woman from the rehab facility, and of course, the relationship ends up kind of becoming toxic, which is just as much. I had as much responsibility for it. And so she was the person that would leave and then come back, and then leave and then come back, and then leave and come back. And during this time, I'm also seeing this therapist, and I managed to stay sober. So at one point, I walked into this therapist's office, and this is about 4 years ago from today, and I hear what I don't really want to hear from a therapist. I hear, "You're not making very much progress," and that's when she has a business card. So on this business card, there's a phone number, and she hands it to me, and she says, "I've never done this before myself, but I've had clients who have too much success, and it's ayahuasca." So at that point, again in my life, I would have done it right. But I wanted to make sure it was with a legitimate group. I wanted to make sure it was in a safe environment. So, I call the phone number, I get the information, and I decide that I'm going to do ayahuasca. And then about a day later, the woman that I had been dating, that I had been in rehab, so she calls me up, and she's like, "Well, I'm going to come see you, I'm going to stay with you, and it's going to be," and then me, I just had this pattern of letting people back into my life, and so I'm like, okay, well, it happened to be the weekend of the Ayahuasca Ceremony. So I decided, okay, well, no ayahuasca, I'm going to see her, and then, of course, like life circumstances, so And again, I promise this is going to lead to what happened in my first ceremony. So I remember very clearly, I'd gotten off work, I'm sitting in my car outside of the casino, and I get a text from the woman that I've been dating in this pattern with. And the text says, I'm coming to Vegas, and I'm not going to see you. So I reacted. I was sitting in my car by myself, and just all of the frustration and the anger and the resentment towards just life and things like that came out. So I was basically sitting in my car swearing. Then I get back together, I recoup things, and I decide, okay, well, I'm going to do this ceremony. So in that weekend, I decide that I'm going to do the Ayahuasca Ceremony. So I walk into the place, and the first ceremony I did was underground. And so the way it's done is it's basically in someone's house. And I go and I feel very comfortable in this environment. I really liked the shaman. Given my background, which was basically you live, you suffer, you die, there's nothing beyond just the physical world. If he would have came in with like a headdress and face paint, I would have walked out. But it ended up being a relatively normal guy. So I attended the ceremony, and the way it just happened to be in the order is I went first. So I went first, and I took the ayahuasca, and then what happened was nothing. So for 4 hours, nothing. I feel nothing at all. Nothing happens. Meanwhile, there's people that are laughing and crying and throwing up and dancing, and I'm just sitting there wondering, like, first I wondered if I got the bad shit, and then I wondered, is nothing ever going to work for me? Is this just futile? Like, I guess just nothing is going to work for me. So I'm sitting there frustrated, and I'm writing in my journal about the traumatic thing that happened with my dad. And then, as I'm writing and frustrated, there's a person that's kind of affiliated with this group that comes over. So she says to me, I'm a healer, can I help you? And again, my belief system, I was kind of like, healer, whatever, sure, do what you want to do. So she sits down in front of me, and then she asks if she can hold my hand. And then she starts telling me the first thing she says, wow, you're really channeling your dad right here. And then I just said it out loud. I was like, bullshit. You saw me write that in my journal. I dismissed everything she said. So she said, okay. She said, first of all, it's dark in here. Second of all, I don't have my glasses on. And then the third thing she did, she took a blindfold and put a blindfold on herself. And then she started telling me all these specific things that happened with my dad and with an airplane. And then she starts telling me all these things in my life that I needed to change and habits I needed to change. And then she starts talking about a situation that happened with a person at work. So there's all these things that are just, like, I'm very aware of what cold reading is. But I start to have, like, what initially happened is I just had this, okay, how is this happening? My mind just starts racing. Wondering, like, how is this possible? And what it felt like is if you've ever been in a house where a storm is really bad and the walls are kind of moving, that's what it felt like in my mind. But then I had the answer. I'm like, I know this, I got this. I know how this is happening, and I realized the therapist that recommended this in the first place, I told the therapist all this stuff. So I'm like, that's what happened. That's what's happening. They get in on some like praying for some joke to like help me. So then in that moment of skepticism, where I figured out what the answer was, the woman in front of me at the ceremony, who has a blindfold on, she kind of turns to the side and she says, why were you saying such bad things about women in your car yesterday? And so that for me, like that, I hadn't mentioned that to anybody. I wasn't even on the phone with the person. And so in that moment, I had, as close as the come to like a death of ego, I had, like, my mind exploded. Because I came to this realization that kind of everything in my life that I believed 100% is true, this live, you suffer, you die, was incorrect. So also in that moment, Ayahuasca kicked in that moment. And then I just had this massive, just completely emotional release. And so, the way I kind of describe this event happening is I had kind of a connection between the spiritual and the physical, which is like an overlap into the metaphysical. And that was the moment in my life where everything changed. That was the moment where I had just like a connection with something that was beyond myself. And then also throughout the ceremony, something that came up through this is that every one of those events, the trauma, the suicidal ideation, the struggle, the event that happened with my dad, of looking my dad in the eyes and him not recognizing us, it was all necessary and it was all perfect. The way it happened was perfect. And it was all necessary to bring me to that point. And then I just had a tremendous amount. I went from a point of believing that, you know, life is suffering and all these things are happening to you to it's happening for you. You know, and even the relationship, you know, there was no one that was right or wrong in this. It was just humans living the best experience that they knew how to do. And so that overall was the start of this process, this complete shift in perspective of where that person is to that person is. And it happened in just one moment with the effects of ayahuasca. And that was what happened for me. So that's kind of my personal story with how this change happened in the first place. That's basically the start of it. And there's a lot more synchronous things and coincidences and things that led to this path, but I do have a limited amount of time, so. Yeah, but overall, like, when I put into the bottom of the shift in perspective, I mean, that was just the biggest thing, because it was a complete change of mindset that eventually affected all the other areas of my life. So I decided to include a quote of, this is just typically what happens when people do have these experiences, and what the plant does. It's from the Mate, and the plant removes the self-created barriers to get in touch with the source of our pain. So that you can realize we've been running from all your life. So now I'm kind of going to go over just what ayahuasca in general is from like if someone else was going to try it. It's a little bit difficult to cover this because every single person's experience is different and every ceremony is different. However, these are things that kind of typically happen or typically come up in ceremonies. So, again, each person's experience is different, but it really creates a profound shift in perspective, transforming the ways in which individuals perceive themselves and past experiences. Ultimately, it's something that helps you come to the realization that nobody is broken, they just need help remembering who they are. So, I if you could have one concept of what ayahuasca does, I feel like this is it. So basically imagine that you have been in a completely dark room your entire life. So, or a house that has no lights. So imagine being confined to the space of this dark house. You're kind of unaware of the dirty dishes or the things that have accumulated over time. So what ayahuasca can kind of do is it's like turning on the lights of this dark house. And if you want to compare that to really what it is your consciousness. So it's illuminating these dark centers of your mind and the places that you kind of hidden down and you haven't accepted as your own. And it's really what ayahuasca does is it acts as the light switch. So turning on the lights and illuminating the aspects of ourselves that require attention and transformation. So we have this, what I said is remembering who you are and illuminating this dark house. However, the way it gets to that comes up in many different ways, and that's different for every person who experiences it. So sometimes what happens is a challenging of your beliefs, and I want to clarify too that it's challenging your beliefs, not your values. So, for example, if you have a partner that you've been married to for 20 years, then you're not going to leave your partner. You're going to value your partner just as much. But there may be some beliefs as far as maybe the way you communicate with them, that might change. So the other one is purging. And purging is usually it's usually not a physical need to throw up. It can be sometimes. But a lot of times it's this emotional, energetic need to throw up, which is just releasing these things that you kind of held on to. And then another thing that happens typically is it happens through trauma release. That can be the purging. It can also be crying, laughing, yawning. Another thing that can occur is just this profound sense of connection to the universe. And evoking and reviewing experiences. Sometimes I say evoking. Sometimes what will happen is people will have this sensation that they are dying. Well, they're obviously not, but the feeling is to release that fear of dying. And then a release of attachments, and then kind of this temporary separation from the ego. The ego is pretty much always going to stay intact, but having this awareness of separation from the self, separation from the thoughts. All right, and in general, here's the process afterwards. So turning on the lights of this dark house doesn't clean the house. So integration is a kind of blanket term, but integration isn't necessarily clearly defined, but integration is integrating the process, incorporating the insights gained during ayahuasca into our daily lives, and taking tangible steps towards healing, growth, and self-improvement. Integration can be done through like a therapist. After I had my experience, I was a lot more open to therapy at that point. It can also be done by developing your own practice. I recommend anything that is a conscious activity, so meditation, yoga, things of that nature. Ultimately the best, there's plenty of integration therapists too. But it is something where I highly suggest integration, because if you just only do the experience, then it really is only an experience. So it can be done independently, or it can be done by yourself. So now, this is 3 years later, and one of the immediate changes that happened, and again, this is different for everybody. Sometimes people have changes that same night, sometimes it's over a course of time. But I'd mentioned that I was a poker dealer. So I had always struggled with social anxiety, and I had this kind of fairly normal fear of just being judged. So when I was at the table, I had this, social card. I went back to work 2 or 3 days later from this experience, from this first ceremony. And when I went back to work, that anxiety was still there, but it was just noticeably it was like the dial was turned way, way, way down. And that's something that typically happens. It's just the fear responses in the brain are just kind of lowered from whatever that's been bothering you. And then perspective shifts and limiting beliefs. These sometimes it takes people months or even years to kind of work through them. But there'll be instances from even just one ceremony where over several months they'll just become more aware of just things that they constructs that have been filtered in that. So something we talk about of what ayahuasca looks like is this 3% shift. So imagine a ship in the ocean that's on this course straight ahead. So if you can just do just a 3% shift, as long as you're able to continue on that path, then ultimately you're going to end up in a massively different place. So now, what I do is, I'm leaving out many details, but I went from being a poker dealer in Las Vegas to now I'm running a retreat center in Mexico. And overall, I think this quote is most representative of my experience. So just this shift in perspective. But believe your tragedies, your losses, your sorrows, your hurt happen for you, not to you. And bless the thing that broke you down and cracked you open, because the world needs you. So that is my presentation. Let me know if you guys have any questions.
I have 2 questions. Where's the girl now? And I'm assuming that the girl that you saw at the ceremony was part of the experience and was not real. Am I correct in assuming that?
So the one woman I actually do talk to every once in a while, but this was actually not a figment of my imagination. So this was a person that actually served in the ceremony. I had some amount of a friendship with her later. It was not a hallucination, or it was actually a real person. What ended up happening, because I kind of talked about it with her afterwards, she just said that when she takes ayahuasca, she has just a heightened sense of empathy and understanding and some amount of this kind of clairvoyance with people. So she was a real person.
How long are the typical experiences or sessions for the...
It also varies for people, but usually the typical experience is about 4 to 6 hours. It depends on the place or the shaman you're doing the ceremony with, but a lot of people too will just allow you to take more. So sometimes you can go as deep as you would like. So for example, when I took it the first time, I felt nothing for 4 hours. Sometimes that happens. But typically, traditionally, they'll let you kind of have the experience go. Ceremonies usually start at about 8 p.m. at night, and then there'll be someone there. It won't necessarily go until 8 a.m., but it'll be kind of that space will be available from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m.
You're running the retreats you're not local anymore, is that correct?
Correct.
You're in Mexico?
I'm not, so I was local that I lived in Las Vegas, and then the shaman is from Mexico, so I live in Guadalajara, Mexico now, and the retreats in Mexico.
I have a question, and I want to preface this by saying that I'm not asking in a way that's challenging, I'm asking from a place of genuine curiosity.
Sure.
So here's my question, just to preface it with knowing I'm curious, not challenging you. I started my relationship with psychedelics after being on suicide watch last August. Corporate ketamine saved my life. And since then, I've really, like most people that have that experience, they immediately go into this space and learn everything they can about it. And I've personally one of the issues that I felt coming up for me is I'm having a very visceral emotional reaction to what I have coined the shamani Beckys and the shaman Bobs, and they're the white people who have a psychedelic experience from South America and the retreat center. That's why I want to say I'm not challenging you on this. My question for you is this: how, as somebody who is not indigenous, using this medicine in a way that is not, I'm not coming from some sort of radical woke leftism, but in a respectful and dignified way where you aren't saying 3 years ago I had an ayahuasca experience and I'm all of a sudden shaman Bob and I'm qualified to go to South America and conduct these very indigenous spiritual ceremonies. Like, how do you do this in a respectful and dignified way?
Well, first, for the record, I'm not facilitating medicine, just so that's clear.
I'm sorry, what?
I'm not the one facilitating the medicine. I'm just the one running the retreat. But I think the person you're going to do a ceremony with is critically important. And so, for example, I mean, the retreat center we have is someone that went to Peru, did a large amount of training with Hebert tribes. To your point, I absolutely agree with you. I think that it should be done with someone that has an intimate knowledge of the medicine. And there's other components too, like most people who are legitimate shamans, they've done like a master plant. They've been in the rainforest, they've connected with the indigenous tribes. I feel like the medicine will do a fair amount of work on its own, but I think it's critically important to pick a person that has a background and a knowledge, and they're not just saying, I'm a shaman, because I mean, anyone can say that.
I mean, there's so many of them from Ohio, because I looked at all the retreats. It's like half of South America is now filled with a bunch of white people from Ohio that did LSD and all of a sudden went to go to retreat centers. So, yeah.
I mean, and what I think I would also just suggest is just ask questions. Like, ask questions about their background, their knowledge. I mean, there's a whole subset of probably questions, almost like a job application of what their background and answering is. And one big one is if they're able to do actual legitimate Icaros. So that's, the healing song that's tradition from the Amazon.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I have a question. Is it a scary experience?
So it's something that is different for everybody. There's been people who've had ceremonies, even myself included, where it's all pretty much gratitude and things from the beginning. But the scary part really is what is, it's not scary, but it can be what's inside. So if you've been suppressing or repressing a lot of trauma, that can come up. So it can be emotionally challenging and difficult. But the purpose of that coming up is to release it, to like let go of it. And then, I suggest doing it in a place too where the people are trained to kind of help you guide you through this process, where the support is there too, just in like a loving, caring environment. Okay, well, I will be around after.